Welcome back to MonsterTamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, for our cutscene and in-game events feature, we worked on updating our NPC to be able to retrace their path, and we added logic so NPCs can give our player monsters. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Now that we have our basic logic in place, for our story events, we're going to enhance this by adding story flags. In our game, a story flag is going to be a mechanism to allow us to do different things in our code based on what the player has done in our game. Some examples of this could be, we could have our NPCs have different lines of dialogue when our player talks to them based on what the player has done in the game. We could use these as triggers to add new items to a shop, so that way only new items show up after the player has reached some type of achievement. And we could also use this to progress our story in that a player might not be able to leave past certain areas until they've done certain things in the game. And so for our current event structure, what we'll do is we're going to set a story flag after our player has talked to the mom NPC, and then we'll be able to use those for our NPCs, and then that way they have dialogue specific to like where the professor was last seen. We're also going to update our events, so then that way some of our events will only be triggered when another event has taken place. And so this is a way for us to build our story, and then that way certain things have to happen before the player can progress. So for our story flags feature, how this will work is in our events JSON, we currently have a custom event type called add flag, and this is going to be used for storing a flag in our data manager that indicates some event has happened in our game. We can then check our data manager when other things happen in our game, like other events or messages from an NPC, and if we see this flag is set, then we can run that logic. How that will work is we're going to add this new requires field to our NPC's messages and as well as our events here from when we copied it, and then we can inspect that and only run our code if that flag is set. As an example, for our second story event, we only want this to be able to be triggered if we've actually seen our first event in our game. So to add these changes, let's jump into our data manager. First thing we'll do is let's add a new field to our global state, so we'll copy our viewed events. Let's paste that. We're going to do flags. And so for our type, this is going to be an array of our game flags. All right, so for our type here, previously when we copied over our type definition file for our various event structure, this also included an object that has our various in-game events that we're going to support for the time being. So these two strings here are the two defined events that we'll be able to support. And as we add more events to our game, we'll be able to add those here. So now if we jump back to our data manager, now we need to update our initial state. So for our initial state, on our initial state, we'll add in flags, and we'll just make this an empty array. So now let's update our store keys. So let's copy our viewed events. We'll paste that. We're going to add in flags. Let's paste that in. And now we need to update our other properties on our data manager so we can reset our values. So we'll copy our viewed events here. We'll do flags, and we'll have our initial state flags. We'll come down a little bit more. And so when we do our update data manager, we'll do the same thing. So we'll have flags, data, flags, and then for our default value, we'll do our initial state flags, and then finally, down in our last method, we'll do our flags, and we'll grab that from our flags from our data manager store keys. So now that we've added this property to our data manager, let's add some methods so we'll be able to get these flags and set them in our data manager. So after our viewed events, let's do get flags. This method will be used for returning all of our current story flags. So we're going to do return, we'll do a new set, and we'll do this, our store, we'll do get, we'll do our data manager store keys, let's do our flags, and then we'll have a default of an empty array if there's no value found. So for this, we're going to return a set of strings that will be our story flags, and that way we can easily find if we have a story flag set in our game. Next, we'll add a method for adding a flag to our data manager. So let's do add flag. We're going to expect our flag name. So now we'll grab our existing flags and add it to our set. So let's copy our logic here from our viewed events. We'll paste that. For our type, this will be a string. So we'll have our existing flags. We'll grab this from our data manager store keys flags. And now that we have our set, we can call our set add, and we'll pass in our flag that was provided. And now we want to store our new value, and we'll do existing flags. Lastly, we'll want a method to be able to remove a flag from our story events. So we're going to do remove flag. We'll expect our flag name. Let's copy our logic for add flag. But instead of using the add method, we'll use delete to remove it from our set, and then we'll update our data manager. Now that we've added our new methods to our data manager, let's jump over to our world scene, and we'll come down to our switch statement where we're going to handle our story events. Currently, for our two types of add flag and remove flag, we just jump to our next event and we don't actually do anything. For these, we're going to add two new methods to our class to handle these. So let's remove our logic. We're going to have a new method. We'll do the add game flag. We'll pass in our event to handle. Let's copy that, and we'll also do that for our remove flag, and then we'll update our method name, and we'll do remove game flag. So now let's jump down to the bottom of our class. Let's add in our two methods. So we're going to have add game flag. We're going to expect our game event. And then we'll have remove game flag. We'll also have our game event for our argument. Real quick, I'll copy our JS stock types from our other method. Let's paste that in. So now in our add game flag method, we'll want to grab our data manager. We'll call add flag, and we'll pass in our game event, our data, and our flag that we want to pass in. Oh, so for our type here, this will be a game event add flag, and this will be a game event remove flag. So after we add our flag, we'll want to jump to our next event that we need to process. So let's copy these two lines of code here. We'll paste them in. Let's copy all of that. We'll come down to remove game flag, and instead of doing add flag, we're going to do remove flag. Now that we've added in our logic for handling our events that are tied to adding flags and removing them, now we need to update our game to first check to see if our player is eligible for that event based on that requires field in our event data. So if we come up to our logic, or we're checking for our overlap with our event zones, before we start our cutscene, we'll want to make sure the player actually meets the criteria for that event. And to do that, we'll need to grab our event data from our cache. So first we need to get a reference to our event ID. So I'm just going to copy this part of our code here. We're going to do const event ID is going to be equal to our zone name where we parse it. Now we want to grab our data for our event. So we'll do const, we'll do event data is going to be equal to our data utils. Now we'll do get event data, and we want to pass in our phaser scene and then our event ID. And now that we have our event data, we can use our requires field to see what story flags are currently set. So for any flag that's set in our requires field for our events JSON, we'll want to make sure that event exists in our data manager under our flags. So back in our world scene, first let's grab all of our flags from our data manager. So we're going to do const, we'll do flags is going to be equal to our data manager dot get flags. Now for every flag that's in our requires array, we want to make sure it exists here. So we're going to reference our event data requires, and then we're going to do every. And now for every flag, we want to make sure that flag exists in our set. So we're going to do return our flags, and then we'll do has flag. All right, so now we'll want to make sure we store our results in a variable. So you do const, let's do event requirements met. And we'll set equal to our loop through our requires array, and we'll just make sure every flag exists on our current flags from our data manager. And instead of doing flags, we're just going to update this to be current game flags. We'll update a reference here. So now we'll only want to run our logic here if our event requirements are actually met. So we'll do if our event requirements are met, then we want to process our lines of code down here. So now if we want to test our changes, we'll want to clear our settings from our cache. So let's do local storage clear in our developer console. Then real quick, let's jump over to our events JSON, and we're just going to add a temporary flag to our first event. We're just going to call this test. And then that way the story flag shouldn't be set. But now in our game, if we try moving our player, we'll see now our event is not triggered since we don't meet this requirement here. If we come over to our data manager, let's add an initial story flag to our array. And so we'll do test. Let's save. And now if we move our player, we'll see now we trigger our cutscene. Our mom shows up and she starts talking to our player. All right, so now we validate it's working. Let's remove our test from here. We'll come back to our events JSON and let's remove that. And for us to test that we're actually adding and removing our flags properly, let's come over to our data manager. We're going to update our player's initial starting position. So we'll do 6 times our tile size to move them over so they're outside our event zone. Now, if we move up to our second event zone, we should see we don't trigger our event because our story flag is not set. Now, if we come back down to our first zone, let's interact with our mom NPC. So she'll show up, and after we're done talking to her, our new methods for storing our story flag should be set. And now, if we come up here, we should now trigger our professor NPC who shows up, and he'll start talking to us. All right, so now we tested our changes. So let's revert our change for our player's starting position back to 4. Now that we verified our story flags are working with our events data, we want to do the same thing for our NPCs. So for our NPCs, we want to extend our JSON file to also have this requires field, and then that way we can have custom messages that are tied to when certain story events are set. So I'm going to jump over to our events JSON. I'm going to copy this requires block, and let's add it to each of our NPC's dialogue messages. So we'll add that right above our type here. Now I'm just going to paste that for each of our various event types. And now what we'll do is for our mom NPC, instead of just having her heal our monsters, we want to wait until we actually found the professor, since now we actually have a monster to heal. So for our requires here, we'll come into our events JSON, and we're going to come down to the very bottom where we set our flag for found professor. So let's add that into our requires array here. And we're going to do the same thing for each of our other events for the mom NPC. So let's just update these. And now if we've not found the professor, we want her to say a different message saying, hey, the professor next door was looking for you. To do that, let's copy this object block here. We'll paste it in. And now for this event, we want to use our looking for professor. So we come back to our events JSON. After our mom NPCs talk to us, we set our story flag for looking for professor. So let's set that here. And we'll update our dialogue. We'll say, the professor next door was looking for you. So now we'll do the same thing for our second NPC. So we'll copy found professor. We'll come down to our existing message. We'll use that as our requires. Let's copy our block here. We'll paste it. Now for our first event, we'll do looking for professor. And for our message, we'll do I last saw the professor heading out of town. Finally, for our last NPC, we won't do our requires here, and so we'll have our dialogue stay the same no matter what our story flag is. So now we've added this new field to our event structure for our NPC JSON file. Let's update our type definition file so we have this new property. So if we come into our typedef.js file, let's copy our type here for where we have our data. Let's paste that in. We're going to change this to be a string array. And so we'll have requires, and let's copy this and we'll paste this on our other events. So we'll add it to our NPC event scene fade in and out and our NPC event heal. Alright, so next, we'll want to update our world scene so when we're interacting with our NPCs, we'll want to inspect our requires field here and make sure we have these story flags when we show our messages. And so this is going to be very similar to the logic that we did for our story flags for our events. Alright, so to add this logic, let's come up to our handle NPC interaction method. And right after we grab a reference to our event that we want to handle, we want to check our requires field on that event, and then we'll compare it with our story flags. So this will be similar to the logic that we added when we were parsing our event data. So I'm going to come back up to that code, and I'm going to copy a few lines of our code here. So I'm going to copy where we grab our flags, and then when we check where the requirements are met. So I'm just going to copy these lines here. Let's come back down to our code, paste that in. Alright, so after we grab our story flags, now we want to check our event to handle and make sure any of our flags that are present there exist in our data manager. So once we check to see if our requirements are met, if they're not met, we want to skip this message and jump to the next one from our NPC. So let's remove this code here. We're going to do this. We'll do handle NPC interaction, and then we'll just return early from our function. All right, so now if we save, we should be able to test our changes. So in our world scene, now if we move our player, our mom NPC should show up. She's going to set our story flag that we're looking for the professor. And so now if we move over by our other NPC, let's try talking to him. And so now we'll see our dialogue shows, I last saw the professor heading out of town. And if we come down to our other NPC, he should still show the original messages that we previously had. And so he just tells us how we can save our game. And then finally, let's check our mom NPC and we'll see if she now shows her other message instead of trying to heal us. All right, so once we get into our house, we'll talk to our mom NPC and she'll say, hey, the professor was looking for you, and we don't do our other events from our NPC JSON file. And just to finalize testing, let's come up to our other event block. We'll have our professor show up, and now that's going to change our story flag. And so now that we found the professor, let's talk to our NPC again. And we should see now he mentions that we should read our signpost. Alright, so now we've finished adding in our logic for our story events, and we validated our new flags work with both our events and our NPCs. One last thing we're going to do before we wrap up is we're going to add some safeguards to our grid utils for our function where we calculate our path that our NPC is going to follow. So currently we have this while loop here where we expect our NPC's position to be equal to our target position exactly. And we don't have any safeguards for if our logic doesn't work, we can easily get stuck in a while loop here. And currently our logic will work as long as our JSON file provides us a valid coordinate for our game, so a valid X and Y value, where if we increment it by our tile size or decrement it, we'll get a nice value where our player character will be at in our game. And so if we ever provide a value that is not valid, we'll get stuck in this while loop here because our x and y values will never be strictly equal. And so to address this, we're going to add some logic where we're going to modify our current position and target position values that are provided to our function such that if they are not divisible by our tile size with no remainder, then we're going to update them so then that way they will be. Ideally, all the positions we get from our event JSON should always be valid, but this will just be an additional safeguard to make sure we have no issues in our code. So to do this, let's check our position x value first. We'll do if our position.x, and we'll do the percent, and we'll do tile size does not equal 0. And so when we divide by our tile size, we want to make sure that we have no remainder. That's what we're doing here. So if it doesn't equal 0, or if our y value doesn't equal 0 when we do the same thing, then we know we have an invalid position and we want to update it. So we'll do our y value. And so to fix this, we're just going to update our positions. We'll do position.x first. We're going to set equal to math.floor. And now we want to take our existing x position. We're going to divide it by our tile size. And now we want to multiply it by our tile size. Now we want to do the same thing for our y value. So I'm going to copy this here. We'll paste it. So now we'll do our position.y and we'll do our position.y. All right, so what we're doing here is we're just taking our position and by dividing it by our tile size, if we don't have a nice value, math.floor is going to round it to the next integer. And now we'll have a nice integer. And then when we multiply it back by our tile size, we should have the appropriate x and y values of where we want our game object to be at. Now we want to do the same thing for our target position. So we're going to copy this here so we can store our value and not mutate our original value. And so instead of doing position, we're going to do position to move to, and we'll make this a const. Instead of our current position, we'll do our target position. So we'll have our target position x and y, and now we want to do a similar check. So I'm going to copy that, I'm going to paste it. We'll do our position to move to, and we'll do those here as well. And so one last thing we'll do is we're just going to add a console log for if this happens. So I'm going to do console.warn, and that way we know we're modifying our position. And we're going to say, we'll do our function name. And we'll say game object position does not line up with grid based on, and so we'll say game object position does not line up with grid based on tile size. Will attempt to convert. So I'm going to copy that console log statement. We'll paste it down here. Instead of game object position, we'll just say target position. All right, so if we save, we should be able to test our changes. So if we move our player down, our NPC should still show up and we should be able to talk to our player. All right, with that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we'll continue working on our cutscene in-game events feature, and we're going to update our cutscenes to have our black bars. So once our cutscene starts, it's going to look like an in-game movie. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please on the links on your screen now.